So now if we go back to the interaction prompt, we can go ahead and sort of preview this in a sense. So if we come into the icon and for the image, we can just choose the radial instance version, and it sort of gives you a bit of a preview there as to what that would sort of look like. Okay, so now we've got that particular material set up, we can go ahead and actually set up the dynamic material instance that we'd use to update the actual look of it. So even though we've got that image set there, it won't actually do anything, it'll just be completely stationary. So we need to set up the logic to control how that will actually function. So if we come into the event graph, and from the event construct we want to create a dynamic material instance. And for the parent, we want to go ahead and choose that radial instance material that we've just created. And then we can just go ahead and promote that to a variable. So I'm just going to call this DMI underscore radial. Like so. And then we actually need to set the brush material for the icon to become this dynamic material. So even though we've got it set in here, that's purely visual. It doesn't do or interact with anything. So we want to replace what's on there with the dynamic one that we've created here. So if we pull the icon radial into the event graph, we can then do set brush. Sorry, we want to do set brush from material. So, and then we can just connect in the dynamic material instance that we've created, like so. Quickly tidy this up a little bit. And the very last step we want to do is just to set the range value, so the parameter in the material, to 0 when it's first created, so it's empty. And to do that, we just get the reference to the dynamic material instance, and then we can do the set scalar parameter value. And then for the parameter name, you want to choose, assuming you've used the same names as me, you want to use range. So what that is, we just open up material. So that's the range there, and that's the one that fills it up, as you can see. Like so. So I'm just going to set that back to 45. And in case you're not sure where that is, so that's this particular one here. So if you name that something else, you just want to make sure it's using the same name in this set scalar parameter value. Okay, so the next things we want to do is to actually, one, be able to control which index we're using for the widget switcher. So whether or not it's showing the button icon or whether or not it's showing the radial timer. So for that, what we can do is just go ahead and create a new function. I'm going to call this one show timer. And I'm going to go ahead and create an input on this particular function. I'm just going to call that one show. And then from the timer switcher, if you want to drag a reference to that into the graph, and you want to set active widget index. We'll just go ahead and call that, set that straight up to the beginning. Now for the index, we want to go ahead and go select int. Select int. And we can connect that, the pick straight up to the show, or the show to the pick. There we go. So if show is, so if it's true, so we want to show it, we want to show the timer, so that's up, index 0, and then when we don't want to show the timer, it'll be 0, so that'll just be the icon. Just like so. And then the next thing we want to do is another function for updating the actual timer itself, so the radial material. So I'm going to create another function called this one update timer. And for this, it needs an input of type float, and that's just going to be called value. It's fine. So this is essentially the percentage that the radial bar is filled, so from 0 to 1. So what we can do is get the dynamic material instance reference again, and we want to do the set scalar parameter value. And here again, you just want to change the parameter name to match whatever it is, so this instance range, and we can connect to the that's sale. So the input value that we're going to expect in here is going to be from 0 to 1, whereas this value here goes from 0 to 360. So what we can do is just multiply this value to 360, and that'll just allow it to display the way it needs to. Lastly, what we can do for this show timer, we can actually do this based on this input value here. So I'm just going to get a reference to that. So get value, this should, at the very bottom. So if this is greater than 0, then we know it needs to be showing that timer. So we just set that straight in there. So the great thing about doing it this particular way and putting it there is whenever we update the timer, it will automatically choose when it needs to show the actual correct icon or not. So instead of having to have two functions, it's just the main one, and it sort of takes it from there. Okay, so that's the widget complete. The next step, I'll just double check where we got to. Yeah, so the UI manager. So what we need to do now is create a function that creates that particular widget when it needs to. So when we're looking at something we can interact with, and remove it when we're not. So what we'll do is create a new function in here, and I'm going to call this one show interact prompt. So we don't want any inputs on this particular one, but what we can do is then get the interaction component, and we just want to get the current hit. Yeah. I think I've got the type set wrong on that one. Yeah, so looks like I've got the type set incorrectly on the interaction component. So that one needs to be the AC interaction base. So I'm just going to update that reference type. So now if we come from here and then we do get current hit. And from the return value that we've got on here for the ball, we want to go ahead and do a branch. So this is, do we have a valid hit that we can interact with? So if we have got a valid hit, what we then want to do is an valid node. Can we get it on here? So the one with the question mark, and we can plug that into the true. So what we actually want to plug into here is the reference to the widget, which we don't actually have yet. So we'll come back to that section in a moment. But if we go ahead and do create widget node, and then for the class, you want to choose the interaction prompt. Just have a quick think. Okay. So just thinking what we could do. Actually, yeah, so it doesn't look like there's an input there for the name. So it would be nice to be able to actually set the name of the interact when we need it to. So if we come back to the interaction prompt widget, and we'll just create a new variable, we'll just call this interact text. And we want that to be of type text. And if we make that instance editable and expose on spawn, and then going back to the main designer view, select the text, and then for the text that's listed, if we click bind, you should be able to select the interact text. So what that will do is it will automatically set the text in here to whatever is listed in this particular variable. So I'm just going to put some default value in there of interact, just in case for whatever reason nothing's specified type of thing. Now if we come back to the manager, you should see the interact text listed in there, and it should have that default value in there. So what we can then do is want a way of actually getting this interaction text, which at the moment we don't have. So if we come in here, yeah. So if we go to the BPI interact, and we can add a new function into there, and we can call this one get interact text. And you just want to add an output to that, which is of type text, and we'll just call that interact text, like so. Now if you go to the NPC, which is one of our interactables, you should then see the get interact text listed. If nothing is in here, then it will be 0, well, to be blank even. So all you have to do is you can either expose it to a variable, or you can just manually type something in here. So I'm just going to type in talk because it's an NPC. If it's something like an object that you can pick up or whatnot, you could always put it as pick up. You could have anything. So if it's a lever, you could say flick lever. Completely up to you. Just change what it says in this particular section here, like that. So coming back to the manager, the UI manager, if we actually get the current hit, we can then call that get interact text. We can plug that straight into there, like so. So this section, we only want to create the interaction widget if we don't have one. So the reference to the widget is going to be plugged into here when we've created it in a second, but we can get that up to the is not valid. From the return value on the create widget, go ahead and just set that value. We can call this interact prompt. So setting it from here, it should automatically create the correct type. So we can go in and connect that to the input object now. So if this particular, if we already have a widget that's created, then it'll do something different. If it's not created, then it will go ahead and create it for us and sets the relevant reference. Okay, so from this set node here, we do then actually need to add it to the viewport, because when you create a widget, it's not automatically added. So if you created widgets before and you're like, oh, why is that not showing? It's because it needs to be added to the viewport. If you create a widget and add it to another widget, so like inside a vertical box or something like that, if that widget itself is already added to the viewport, then it will automatically show it. But if it's not, then you will need to add the add to viewport. The next thing we need to do is actually update that interact timer. So if we pull off from the interact prompt, and we should be able to call that update timer function. And we just want to connect that to the is valid. So if it does exist, just update the timer. If it's not, create the widget first and then update that timer. So just tidying these up a little bit. Straighten those nodes. Okay, so with the update time, we need to get what this value is. So for that, we can drag in the interaction component again. So just a reminder, this is just the base one. But if you remember all the way back to the very first part of the tutorial, there were two values that we created. So this is current hold duration, and then the interact hold timer. So we'll just get those variables. And then we can just, because it needs to be normalized between 0 and 1, we can just divide the current hold time by the desired hold times for the interact, like so. Okay, so the last thing we need to do in this particular section is just handle what we do when there isn't a valid hit. So what we can do is just copy this section here again for the is valid. So this is where we're checking, do we have the widget visible or not? And if it's not valid, then that's great, so it means it's not on the screen. However, if it is, what we want to do is actually remove it from the parent. So we get the widget prompt again, so the interact prompt, and we just want to remove from parent, like so. Now the thing with widgets is even though it's not on the viewport, if it's stored in a reference, it will still be there in the RAM. And you can still reference this to then add it to the viewport again if you wanted to, which in this case I don't particularly want to do. So what I'm going to do is actually just set that again, but leave it empty, and that's what will make this particular reference invalid because there won't be anything in there. The widget itself will then at some point get cleared as a part of the next garbage collection, and that'll sort of stop the references from piling up. So in terms of everything here, as far as I can see, it should all be working now. So let's just have a quick check. Okay, so it's not showing there. So that's it. Yeah. So what we need to do, that function that we just created, the show interact prompt, it's not actually being called anywhere yet. So what we can do is if we go back to the main event graph, and then on the event tick, we can just call that particular function. So I know a lot of people tend to get a bit concerned with the event tick, saying, oh, you shouldn't run things on tick, it can be bad for performance. And whilst generally I would agree with that term, it's more about what's being done on tick. So in this particular instance, in the show interact prompt, if there's nothing to interact with, as in it doesn't need to do anything, it's only really got 2 checks, so it's not really going to impact on performance. And if there is something that needs to be done, then it needs to be updated on tick anyway to give that smooth sort of UI feel. Otherwise, if it's not on tick, it'll be quite clunky, which generally is not what you want with these types of things. So you can get away quite happily with the event tick. Okay, so now if we go ahead and test it, hopefully you can see there that we get the prompt. So yeah. So a few other things that you can do, just to make things look a little bit nicer, because if you notice for myself, I do have the line tracers visible, but obviously as a player you don't want to leave those running. So if I'm just going to quickly go back to the interaction core just to disable the line tracers on the trace for interact. And then I'm going to go ahead and create another widget just for the cursor. Obviously it's up to you how you want to handle it's like a cursor in the middle of the screen. Like so, add a canvas panel. I'm just going to do an image, add it to the canvas panel, leave it how that is. I want to size to content, and I want to make it 2 by 2. For the anchors, I'm going to change the anchor to centered, and just make sure the position are all reset. And then for the alignment, just set that to 0.5 for both of those. So that way there's going to be a little dot in the middle of where we look. And then on the UI manager, on the begin play, I'm just going to create a widget and just create that cursor prompt. And then just add that to viewport. So with this particular method, it does mean the cursor would always be on screen. But like I said, it's up to you how it is you want to handle the cursor itself. But you can see now that the cursor is in the centre of the screen, so it's a little bit more, a little bit easier to distinguish where one can interact. A few other little changes that we can make with this particular project before I wrap up is I'm just going to go into the third person character and just adjust where the camera is. So the camera at the moment is at the hips, and I want to move that up more in line with the shoulders. So we just sort of see how that looks. So that to me just feels a little bit nicer instead of sort of like looking. Yeah, again, it's all down to preference. The last thing I want to do as well is, so there's the interact there. So if you're holding the key down, it'll fill up, and then when it fills up, you get the interact. Is I actually want to go ahead and just modify on here the position that this is. So you can see where the center, the little flower pattern thing is. That's sort of the center. So we can actually adjust this accordingly to be a bit more centered. So you probably need to have a little play yourselves to figure out where the best spots are. Okay, I think that might be it. I think that looks about right. But yet again, it's sort of all depends on what you're wanting to do. So in this particular example, the circle sort of like rotates around the interact prompt. Okay, so we've nearly finished. So at the moment, when we've interacted, we can still move around, and we don't actually have the cursor, which isn't ideal. So let me have a quick think. So I'm just going to go to the main interaction one. That's just for that. That's fine. Okay, yes. So in terms of disabling the inputs and things like so you can't move, something like that, it's best to handle inside the whatever it is that you're interacting with. Just because there might be certain things that you don't want to disable the input for. Let's say if you're doing an item pickup, for example, you don't want that to stop the player character from moving around. You know, just not a sort of interaction that would trigger that. But with, say, talking to an NPC, that might be the sort of thing you want. So what we can do, so we do have the NPC base in this particular example with the NPC mouse. So if we go to the mouse one where the interact is happening, what we can do, so similar to inside the main interaction one here, we get the player controller and then get that input controls. We can do something similar. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and copy that into the base and connect that straight to here. Although it's not the add input mapping that we want, it's the remove input mapping. And what I'm actually going to do is just remove the default context mapping, and that's the mapping that has all the movement controls in it. So if we remove that, that will prevent the player from being able to move. The next thing we can do is want to show cursor. So from the player controller, we can just get show cursor. Like so. And then the last thing we want to do is actually just re-enable that control when the conversation's finished, so when they've exited. So this is in the NPC base under the conversation closed. So yet again, in a lot of cases when you're setting up your interactions, there's probably going to be the initial interact, and then there'll be some sort of event that will happen when you've exited. So this is where you would put that sort of logic. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this section again, and this, and then in the base, I want to sort of do the same thing. This time I want to do the add input mapping, and want to add the default one back on, and then we can just hide the mouse cursor again. Okay, so now if we test it out, so we hold E to interact, when it fills up, we do get the icons. We get the dialogue system to show up. So you will find with, particularly with some systems that deal with UI, so I'll quickly show that again. If when you interact and it first pops up, like the overlays aren't happening on the button, and the reason why is because this particular user interface doesn't have focus. So if I click on it, it then updates accordingly. But the buttons itself do work. But again, it would be up to you to figure out the best way to deal with how you would give that focus to the player characters. I know in the open conversation in this particular example, also we create it there. Set focus. So we can just do set focus like that, so that might resolve it. In this particular example. No, it's not done it. we do have an error. Does not support focus. Okay, so it's not the right type. Okay. So what we can do instead then is set UI input only. So we do need the player controller here. So we get the player controller, and then we can input that particular widget. That might give us the focus that we need. Yeah, so there we go. So we set it to UI and that's focus, then those sort of buttons will work. Again, you might not actually run into this problem. It depends on how you're sort of handling other inputs. But if you're following along with the conversation, there's sort of some of the tweaks that you might need to make. So yeah, so that's the how you can set up an interaction system within Unreal Engine 5. Hopefully you've learned a few things, particularly different ways of doing something, particularly in regards to inheritance and why it is that you might want to break bits of logic up into little pieces and use them as building blocks almost. So yeah, so obviously just to go over one of the reasons why else you could use, why else this could be a good reason to use, is like take the interaction system itself that controls the visual aspect of the interact, so sort of showing the outline and the text, things like that. If you wanted to, you could create another child of the core and have it display everything completely different and have that on a different character. So instead of having to create different, instead of having to recreate all this logic, you don't need to. You just create a new child and add that in there. So it's certainly a lot of flexibility in terms of how you can use this system and how you can build upon it. So yeah, so I just want to say thanks for watching, and I hope you find that video useful. If you do use this in any projects, obviously by all means let me know. And if you did like the video, leave a like. Yeah, why not subscribe? I can't guarantee I'll be frequent with the videos, but try to release them when I feel there's something to show, and something to hopefully teach you all. But yeah, thanks for watching and take care. Bye.